This video is aimed at anyone that's just getting started in electronics, and it was prompted by a few questions I've been asked recently of how I got involved in electronics, how I got started, the equipment I started off with, and how I went about learning electronics and mechanics as well. And what we've got here is a very simple motor, as you can see, and it's one of the first things I ever built in terms of electronics. And I built one of these when I was about 7, and it came about as a result of my parents getting tired of me dismantling every electrical device in the house, and finally they started realizing I was interested in this sort of thing. And a relative bought me a book on how to build a transistor radio. I didn't really understand much about it when I first started reading it, but it did really prompt me into getting more interested in the subject. So I started doing this sort of thing. I didn't have any test equipment, I didn't have any real workshop, I didn't have a soldering iron. All I had initially, really, literally, was a piece of wire. And with a piece of wire and a piece of cardboard and some sellotape, a couple of magnets, I made a motor. I'll just turn this off so it's not going to keep annoying us. I also made things like this. This was a buzzer, made relays, all sorts of things, and really I did this without the benefit of any electronic kits. As I say, I didn't have a soldering iron, I didn't really have a lab or anything. I just used the kitchen table, and started getting interested more and more in how this sort of thing worked. And so this video is really aimed at the advice I would offer to anyone that really seriously wants to get involved in electronics. And the first advice I would give, and this is just my opinion, it's different people have different ideas as to how to go about this, so this is just the way I would advise anyone getting properly interested in electronics. So the first thing is, in terms of how to go about doing this, I would say that what you should not start doing is buying something like this. Now, this is really a sort of one of these demo kits you can buy, and it's obviously an FPGA. It's quite a comprehensive thing. These are extremely useful if you are already experienced with electronics and you're trying to develop something and you want to just avoid having to make up prototype boards. The same is true of something like this for ARM processors, exactly the same principle, and on a simpler format, something like this, again an FPGA, it's just really a breakout board with some onboard memory to hold the configuration for the FPGA, and these come in very useful if you are developing products. So for example, I used one of these fairly recently to develop a system to drive a VGA monitor using FPGA, and really this was to replace an IC that was no longer available on an old piece of equipment. It had a dedicated video chip. These come in very handy for this sort of thing, but these will not teach you much about electronics. They're fun, and they may teach you how to program and how to configure various devices, but they will not teach you much about electronics. If you want to learn the inner workings of electronics, I fully and strongly recommend that you get something like this. Now, this is something I had, it's probably the first thing I ever got that was really dedicated towards electronics. This is not actually the one I had at the time, that long since wore out. I used it so much that all the little contact strips started cracking and falling apart. This is one I got off eBay fairly recently. This is, in more modern terms, we would use one of these. It's obviously a breadboard, and I'll just clear this out of the way, and we'll have a discussion about this and what I did with it. Okay, so somehow I managed to obtain one of these. Now, I didn't have any money at all when I was getting started in electronics. I couldn't afford to buy test equipment, I couldn't afford to buy components, and I had one of these. I can't remember where I got it from. I'm assuming a relative must have bought it for me, but I got one of these when I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and I'd already been building circuits for several years by then, and when I got this, it was kind of a revelation. It made things so much easier. I also managed to find a transistor from somewhere. Again, I can't remember where I got it from. Maybe it came in the kit that the breadboard was in. But these were, this made it extremely easy to start experimenting. So basically, like any breadboard, you can just insert the components, and it made life so much easier. Okay, so once I had this and I could start experimenting, I started looking into how a transistor works, and this is what I recommend you do. Don't go for one of these all singing, all dancing development kits until you know how a transistor works. I had some comments fairly recently saying that all transistors are basically the same as MOSFETs, and they absolutely are not. They are very different. And you may be aware I sell a lot of reproduction boards and kits, and I do not provide tech support for them, well, at least not to any recognizable level. And I do that for several reasons. One is I don't have the inclination or the time to do that, but also I want to sell these kits on this kind of basis, that it's up to the builder to learn the skills required to put them together, not just put something together like an Arduino kit. It starts flashing the LED and then you move on without really understanding why. So what I did once I had this was I started experimenting. So what I began doing is I'd draw up a very simple circuit like this. I'd then, before I put the circuit together, start calculating the expected currents and voltages. I'd then put the circuit together on the breadboard and try to figure out if I'd got this right. Wasn't that easy? As I say, I didn't have much test equipment. So I finally got a very cheap test meter, then I could start taking sensible measurements. Before that, I had to find various weird and wonderful ways of trying to figure out what the circuit was doing. But it did teach me to become very inventive. I then moved on, managed to get some more components. I used to get them from old scrap TVs and that sort of thing, and started building small 4-bit computer systems. So very simple, basically a series of flip-flops, and all cobbled together in such a way that I could use them to control small robots I was building. But the whole point is that I spent literally months and months going over circuits like this, changing the values, changing the configuration, learning exactly how this worked. I then went on to learn how the actual transistor itself works. Once you've done that, you can apply that knowledge to much more complex circuits, but you can't really do the reverse. And once you understand the basics of how a transistor works, how an IC works, then it makes understanding much more complicated circuits much easier. So if you're getting started in electronics, I highly recommend look on eBay, find one of these kits. They're still available, and although there are more modern versions of these kits, something like this, I picked this up recently off eBay. I was actually trying to get hold of one of these so I could make this video. I couldn't find one of these on its own, but I did find a kit that had one in, and I never had one of these until now. But these are, I think, an extremely good way for anyone who wants an introduction into electronics. So the way these worked is you just get the breadboard, you'd get these overlay cards, you'd find the relevant chapter in the book, and then you could drop one of these cards onto the breadboard. There were two of these breadboards, one with this configuration with two transistors, and one with a central single one that's laid out like this. I never had that one before, I only had this red one. But you can put these overlays on. There were various wire jumpers and other components in the kit. You put it all together as shown on the overlays and on the schematics, all these layouts, and then you can make various simple circuits. And that's what I did. I just went through and made very simple circuits, but I didn't move on until I fully understood exactly how the circuit worked. So something like this, I didn't just put it together as was shown and then it would flash a light or whatever it was supposed to do and then move on. I would go through, I'd dissect it, work out exactly how it worked, what it did, test my assumptions, and if I'd got it wrong, it didn't match what I thought, I'd go back, re-educate myself until I knew exactly what was going on. Once you do something like this, you're never going to say a MOSFET and a bipolar transistor are the same thing. In some instances, yes, they can be interchangeable, but they are most certainly not the same. And this is how I learnt all this. And once you've been through all this, and I did this literally for years, I just went over and over these circuits, built increasingly complex circuits, but always with the fundamentals in mind. So fundamentally, how does a transistor work? What could I use in terms of the layout of the circuit? How could I change it? How could I modify it? And going through something like this is an extremely good learning tool if you are just getting into electronics. Even for someone like me that's been playing about with electronics for over 50 years, I still find things like this fascinating. It's basic, but that's not to say it's a negative thing. There's nothing wrong with the basics, and even now for me, I learn something new every day, and I would fully recommend going out and picking something like this up if you're just getting into electronics. You could of course use something more modern like this, but there's a certain appeal, at least for me, for something like this. Even now, the layout of these two triangles kind of sort of dictates some of my board layouts. I noticed that I have a specific way of putting the pinouts on the boards I design, and I think that may well lead back to the way I used to put the transistor into these breadboards. So that's what my recommendation would be. Go out, get something like this. Initially, avoid something like that. These are great later on. Once you've got the fundamentals, these are great to play with. They're great for prototyping, that sort of thing, but they're not the way to learn electronics. Something like this is going to carry you far further, in my opinion.